Welcome to Windows on the World. Tonight we're going to be talking about Mithra, the cult of Mithra, New Jerusalem and the Holy Grail. We're going to be talking about cults, persecuted cults, the Inquisition and beyond. We're going to be talking about the Knights Templar, also known as the Poor Knights of Christ, and the Age of Chivalry. Let's start with Mithraism. Originally Persian, Mithra was the god of light, identified with the sun, who slew a primordial bull and fertilized the world with its blood. Is the cult of Mithra still alive today? Well, we will be looking at this incorporation and also the reaction against it through the Age of Chivalry and its legends of King Arthur, the Round Table, and then the Knights Templar, also known under different names such as the Knights of St. John of Jerusalem, the Poor Knights of Christ and the Temple of Solomon, to name but two. The Roman Church had incorporated Mithraic sacrifice into their church, which is evidenced by the altar, which is still present in churches today. There is nothing Christian about the altar. The altar is for sacrifice. Did this mean that the early Roman Church indulged in human sacrifices to attain protection and power? Well, according to one researcher that I spoke to over many years, who was actually trained in a Jesuit college and knew an awful lot about the Roman Church and was an ecclesiastical scholar, it actually did indulge in human sacrifice. This is the Roman Church and allegedly still does. And this researcher also told me that the altar slab would be removed and inside there was a chalice, a Grail cup, which would contain the blood of a newborn. This was for the removal of sin through purity. The next level would be a young boy who would be bound as a familiar, followed by a young girl representing the banshee. All this meant to wipe away sin and give protection. Well, this sort of initiation was a leftover from the pagan Mithraism of the Roman cult. The early Roman initiation into the usurped Christianity of Constantine may well have included human sacrifice. We don't know because the Romans wrote the history. Well, the same researcher actually did tell me that this was still going on in certain prescribed churches. And given the times that we're in, it's certainly worth thinking about. The new Roman Church of Constantine had absorbed the paganism of Mithra into a new cult, and Christian symbols were taken from pagan symbols. Most of the hieroglyphs and symbols of paganism passed into Christianity. Well, we see the vine and the processes of converting its fruit into wine. All this originating among the heathens and, of course, to the rites of Bacchus, as witnessed in the bread and wine of the Eucharist. The rites of the Mithraic sacrifice came about through their initiations, and initially there were 3 degrees in Mithraism. It was originally a solar cult and it had a 365-day year, of course originating in Persia and adopted by the Romans. It is said that the previous 360-day year was changed to 365 days by the pharaohs and adopted by the Romans. Well, on the Mithraic monuments we find representations of the globe of the sun, the club and the bull. These were thought to be symbols of the highest truth, the highest creative activity and the highest vital power. Again, we go back to the sacrifice of the bull here. So such a trinity was also present in the time of Plato. This consists of the supreme God, the Word, and the soul of the world. A trinity was present at the time of Hermes Trismegistus, consisting of light, intelligence and soul. Also with that of Porphyry, which consists of Father, the Word and the Supreme Soul. By the way, Porphyry lived from 234 approximately to 305 AD and was a Neoplatonist philosopher born in Tyre in Phoenicia. He studied with Longinus in Athens and then with Plotinus in Rome from 263 to 269 and became a follower of Platonism. So we see that these cults were present before and they were using the Trinity, which was later adopted into the Roman Church. Of course, the Roman Church had Father, Son and Holy Ghost. The Trinity always makes sense and includes the act of creation, Father, Mother and Son. The Roman Church legal system used the Trinity in trust law. So we have a grantor, we have a trustee, and we have the beneficiary. It's always these three items. And according to Herodotus, Mithras became the Mylitta of Babylon, the Assyrian Venus, worshipped as the female principle of creation, the goddess of fecundity and of life. The worship of Persian Mithra, or Apollo, spread over Italy, Gaul, Germany and Britain. Mithraic rites of initiation. Well, where did all this happen? The sanctuaries of this worship were always subterranean, underground, and in each sanctuary was placed a ladder with 7 steps by which one ascended to the mansions of felicity. The initiations into this degree were more severe than into any other, and few passed through all the tests. The festival of the god was held towards the middle of the month of Mithra, which is October, and the initiate had to undergo long and severe trials before he was admitted to the full knowledge of the mysteries. The first degree was inaugurated with purifying, and a sign was set on the neophyte's brow whilst he offered to the god a loaf and a cup of water. A crown was presented to him on the point of a sword, and he put it on his head and said, "Mithras is my crown." The priests and officers of the temple, often disguised as lions, tigers, leopards, bears, wolves, sounds a lot of fun, doesn't it, and other wild beasts, attacked the prospective candidate with fierce howlings. In these sham fights, the aspirant ran great personal danger, though sometimes the priests caught them and made it a lot worse. And we are told that the Emperor Commodius, on his initiation, carried the joke a little too far and actually ended up killing one of the priests who had assailed him dressed as a wild beast. And of course, this is adopted into Freemasonry, and we're going to get into that as the show goes along. And these initiations were adopted, yes, into those first 3 degrees, the basic 3 degrees of Freemasonry. The 3rd degree being reborn from the coffin into the brotherhood, and the oath of secrecy, of course, with the blindfolding and being roughed up in a reconstruction of the architect Hiram Abiff not divulging what became the Freemasonic passwords of Solomon's Temple. In the next Mithraic degree, the initiate put on a mantle on which were painted the signs of the zodiac. A curtain then concealed him. When this was opened, he saw frightful griffins, so they must have had a lot of costumes in these Mithraic temples. After passing through other trials, if his courage did not fail him, he was then hailed a Lion of Mithras, in allusion to the zodiacal sign in which the sun had attained its greatest power, Leo, of course. We meet with the same idea in the degree of Master Mason, and of course, these beliefs are still present in the Scottish Rite. The grand secret was then imparted, but what was it? At this distance of time, it is difficult to decide, but we may assume that the priests communicated to him the most authentic traditions, the best accredited theories concerning the origin of the universe, and the attributes, perfections, and work of Oromazes. The Mithraic mysteries represent the progress of darkness to light. The ceremonies connected with the myth of Tammuz, the Chaldean sun god. So this goes back a very long way, and it ties in to shows that we've done previously, like Demons of Babylon. And we can see that from these 1,000-year-old cults, nothing much has changed with the modern-day cult of the Roman Church. And Mr. M. Lenormant was the first to demonstrate from the Assyrian tablets that Tammuz was the prototype of Adonis, and all of the subsequent sun gods worshipped in various countries and under various names were all basically linked. There is never anything complicated in these cults, and the worship of the sun is present in most of them. And on those tablets that Mr. M. Lenormant talked of, we find the story of Ishtar, the prototype of Astarte, Isis, and the other female deities who afterwards, under various names, represented cosmically the female principle and astronomically the moon. Well, the great festival of Tammuz was held at the summer solstice, and even now in the Jewish calendar the month of July goes by the name of Tammuz. This festival lasted 6 days, and in the functions ascribed to each day we find a curious agreement with the corresponding properties of eternal nature. The first day was a day of rest, motionless, inactive. The second and third days celebrated the struggle of the imprisoned life to become free. They were days of grief and suffering. The fourth day was dedicated to the conquest over lions and serpents, that is to say, the fire. Thus, the fourth property began the conquest of the first three, or dark properties. And the fifth day was considered favourable for sacrifice. The happy influence of the newly risen sun or light became perceptible, and on the sixth day, the conjunction of sun with Ishtar was celebrated with joyous songs and probably a lot of merriment. The 8th chapter of Ezekiel comprises the day of mourning, and also that of rejoicing at the recovery of Tammuz. Thus, the origins of Mithra were delivered through the Roman Church of Constantine. Well, the Roman Church really began on AD 325 when Constantine transported the original Christianity to what is now called present-day Israel. This is, of course, tying in with our work that we've been doing on Britain's Shattered Isles and the moving of Christianity to this place now known as Israel. Well, Jerusalem, after being invaded and taken by Hadrian in 135 AD, ceased to be called Jerusalem until Constantine had renamed it in 325 AD. Constantine and his mother Helena transplanted the Roman version of Christianity to present-day Israel or Palestine. It was known as Philistinia also. And of course, this was part of Canaan. And we had Judea and Samaria. These were all parts of this quite small landmass. So now let's get on to another aspect of this, replacing Jerusalem. Britain, the Key to World History by William Comyns Beaumont. Well, Constantine was said to have recognised Christianity as his faith and to have gained victory under the sign of the cross. Subsequently, he became sole dictator of the Roman Empire, and for reasons only known to himself, caused Jerusalem to be publicly discovered, in inverted commas, with other alleged biblical sites in the present-day Israel. If he had strong reasons for wishing to transfer the early sites of Christianity to the Near East, making Constantinople the centre of his empire, there was little opposition to fear from any quarter at this particular time, especially when a most drastic censorship had been placed on any writings which may be inconvenient to the new cult. He was thus able, with conspirators, to place it in the Near East, although it probably never entered his head that his act of deception would successfully fool the world for a period of over 1600 years. So, if we look at it this way, things do start to add up. And this, of course, ties into our shows on Britain's Shattered Isles. We'll be carrying on with this. And if you want to know more about it, go to windowsontheworld.net and just put Britain Shattered Isles into the taskbar and it all comes up. So Constantine was thus able to place this new area, this new Israel in the Near East, although it probably never entered his head that, as we've said, it would last for a period of well over 1600 years. And in 326 AD, Constantine dispatched his mother, the Empress Helena, on a mission to the New Jerusalem to discover some sacred sites. And Helena, Constantine's mother, by that time was quite old, but she was an ardent Christian. Her son supplied her with ample funds, and history records that high ecclesiastical personages had been advised to escort her and assist her to discover the exact spots where Jesus had been born, crucified and buried. Of course, we've been contending that Britain was the true home of Christianity, so this may sound a bit strange to people who are hearing it for the first time. Of course, we have the story that in 597 AD, we get a pilgrimage, I think St. Bartholomew, who converted the kings of Kent to the new Christianity. But Christianity had been in Britain a long time. And the first Christian church was in Glastonbury, dated to around 33 AD. This is what they say. But it's certainly a lot further back than the Romans are telling us. Because if you go to any of these old churches in Britain, they all say around 600 AD, because that's the official cover story that the Romans gave. But getting back to Helena, her especial task was to find the true cross, or the cross which would suffice to be found, which would masquerade as the true cross. On the authority of St. Cyril, who was present, this actual cross was unearthed at Mount Calvary, lying deep in the soil, along with two others identified as those of the malefactors crucified at the same time as Christ. It certainly needs consummate faith to accept these miraculous finds. The Empress thereupon caused the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to be erected on this sacred spot, and the other two crosses were set up in churches devoted to the Nativity and the Crucifixion. So we have to remember that the Church of Holy Sepulchre was actually on the site of a temple of Venus, and could well have been the site of a Mithraic temple before they converted it to their new version of Christianity, which we're contending actually did not start in the place which is now present-day Israel. These discoverers and discoveries followed shortly on from the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, at which Constantine decreed formally that the Christian religion was in future to be that of the whole Roman Empire, whereby complete doctrinal power was placed in Roman hands. Many historians have suggested that it was an astute political move on part of Constantine, for in doing so he deposed the god Mithra, who had been installed as the chief deity by Maximian. Mithra was now deposed and Christ reigned in heaven. As the result of the Empress Helena's pilgrimage, and with stirring accounts of other miraculous happenings, the New Jerusalem began to attract pious Christian pilgrims, and before very long, under imperial patronage, it prospered. However, Julian in 361 AD became undisputed master of the Empire of Rome, and although brought up as a Christian, he devoted himself to Greek literature and philosophy and abandoned Christianity, and avowed himself a follower of Mithra. In 363 AD, just before he was slain in battle against the Persians, Julian gave the Jews permission to rebuild their temple in the New Jerusalem. Then a curious event happened. The foundations had been laid, the building was about to commence, and all was in readiness when a severe earthquake destroyed all the work thus far completed. And the Christians regarded this as the warning hand of the deity and showed distinct hostility towards any further effort on the site, and so it was abandoned. The subsequent history of this Jerusalem is not at all distinguished. In 614, the Persians took the city by assault and sacked it thoroughly. The churches of Constantine, of Helena and of Justinian were gravely damaged. All the wealth obtained from pilgrims was seized and the supposed true cross taken away into Persia. Again in 634, the famous Omar became Caliph of the Arabia and captured Jerusalem again from the Christians, who, however, were permitted still to live there. He selected the supposed site of Solomon's temple for his mosque to Muhammad, where it is at the present time. Needless to add, it was never the site of Solomon's or Herod's temple. And this is a very important point, because even though there has been much excavation and much speculation, not much has been forthcoming to prove anything which connects present-day Israel to the story that we have been told exists in that particular part of the world. So, with this in place of the cover story, things certainly seem to make more sense. The pre-Christian cults were incorporated into the doctrine and dogma, and the early Christianity had been all but eradicated. That's something that's very important. The original way, the simplicity of the teachings had been taken over by a corporate entity, which was based on the cult of Mithra, and incorporated paganism, including, of course, as we've said, the altar, into their version of Christianity. Well, isn't it interesting that at present, this present version of Israel appears to be coming to an end? So now let's take a short break, and we'll come back and talk more about the Roman cult. Welcome back. So going back to the Roman cult, we now come to the abolition of mysteries. And of course, the number of the universal faithful had greatly increased. In 692 AD, everyone was ordered thenceforth to be admitted to the public worship of the Roman Church. The original Christian esoteric teaching of the first ages was entirely suppressed, and what had been pure cosmology and astrology alongside this was turned into a pantheon of gods and saints. Nothing remained of the mysteries but the custom of secretly reciting instead the canon of the Mass. The biggest outreach against those outside the cult was, of course, the Inquisition. Those who rejected the new order of Rome were denounced as heretics. The Universal Church of Rome instigated the Inquisitions. The Spanish Inquisition, as it was known, was actually a judicial institution that lasted from between 1478 and 1834. So it was only kind of officially stopped quite recently. Its ostensible purpose was to combat heresy in Spain, but in practice it resulted in consolidating power in the monarchy of the newly unified Spanish kingdom. Its brutal methods led to widespread death and suffering. Taking their name from the Latin verb inquiro, to inquire into, these commissions had authority to question supposed heretics about their religious practices and loyalties, starting in around the 13th century. Unlike most of Western Europe at the time, medieval Spain was a multiracial and multi-religious country with large Muslim and Arab and Jewish populations. The wars against the Moors had been won in the 8th century. The Albigensians, the Cathars and the Troubadours, along with the Bogomils, were some of the persecuted sects. There were many sects named heretical by the Church of Constantine, including, of course, the Cathars of the Languedoc. The Albigensian crusade, of course, was to wipe out the Cathars and the Albigensians. The Cathars could not understand how Christians could adore the instrument of the death of the Saviour, the cross, and said that the cross was the figure of the beast, which was mentioned in the Apocalypse, and an abomination, and it should therefore not be displayed in a holy place. This was also the belief of the Protestant reformers, of course, later, and their crusade against idolatry. Well, like the Druids, the Cathars performed their ceremonies in woods, caverns, remote valleys, and those belonging to this new heresy and others deriving from it went to the places that had existed long before the new lodges of initiation and the new churches with their Mithraic sacrificial altars. In every place, the Cathars were accused of strangling or starving the dying and of burning children. Of course, this is the sort of gaslighting that we have in Roman history. The Druids were treated in exactly the same way. Once they had been wiped out by being set upon each other by the Romans, it was stated that the Druids would cut out the innards of Roman soldiers. They would cut out their intestines and divine the future from them. The Romans had used this negative propaganda against the Druids, and one of the reasons we know so little of them is, of course, because of the wiping out of the history, of course, by those the Romans did not like. The rebellion against Rome was with Jerusalem, the New Jerusalem. The heretical revolt against the Roman Church was to deny Rome and glorify Jerusalem, the founding of a heaven on earth. It was said that Godfrey of Boulogne was proclaimed the king of the New Jerusalem. Godfrey was actually a leader of the First Crusade and the first ruler of the Kingdom of Jerusalem from 1099 to 1100. Like those described as heretics, the Knights Templars also rejected the Roman Church symbol of the cross. To them, also, it was an instrument of death and torture. And from this most likely came the alleged heresies of the Templars, who were accused of spitting on the cross. The initiations of these groups was in a similar vein to that of the ancient Druidic orders. So this is also a very interesting point when we look at the origins of Freemasonry. Of course, we've got Templar Freemasonry. Templar Freemasonry also became very Kabbalistic in the 17th, 1800s, and we have this mishmash, which is basically the cult of Freemasonry, which captured, of course, Europe and the world through the Asiatic Brethren, and of course the lodges of Europe, the Illuminati lodges. We've covered those quite a lot in recent shows. We've covered, of course, the Martinists and the Ellis Cohens, and these are still in existence today, and they were very instrumental during the French Revolution, and of course especially during the Russian Revolution also. Well, of course, when we talk about the initiations of these groups, it does all tie into very similar belief systems. And really, this was to counter the Roman cult later on of the Universal Church of Catholicism, this idea of the New Jerusalem. And at this time, life was almost unbearable to the serfs, the bondsmen, the common people. They felt they had been forgotten and forsaken by God and his saints. So something very strange happened during this period. Those who felt that the church and God had abandoned them appealed to the devil for protection, and hence a kind of devil worship arose. And this cult were actually called the Luciferians. Therefore, we may accept the charge brought against the Luciferians of believing in the devil's eventual restoration. A cult called the Everlasting Gospelers was also around, and they held this belief alongside these people who rejected the Roman Church. This is very mixed up stuff and very anti-Christian. It has nothing to do with the original teachings. We are told that the Luciferians had their signs of recognition and used to accost one another. Thus is what they said: Lucifer, who has been wronged, greets thee. To prevent an uninitiated person to enter their assemblies, they would put their question thus and say, do thorns prick today? The answer to this is actually not recorded, obviously because it was a secret and it probably changed like a password. But of course, it was known to the initiated and the initiated only. The places where they held their meetings were called cellars of repentance. The charge of committing unnatural crimes brought against them was one brought by the church against all heretics, but the Luciferians were not actually accused until late into the 13th century. Ironically, when the sect had actually ceased to officially exist. having been exterminated by the word and suffering death by fire through the Holy Church of Rome. So those who were part of this sect were burnt at the stake or tortured and had to repent and accept the Roman Church. There existed numerous other sects around this time, named either after their founders or even the localities in which they had been born, such as the Messalanians, the Bogomils, who became the Canians, the Encraftitites, and more. These belief systems had created a chaos which brought about, really, it had been brought about by the Church of Constantine and its relentless persecution, torture and burning of heretics, meaning those who are able to choose. That's what heresy means. It comes from heretikos, the Greek, meaning to choose. You were given a choice. You either repent and fully convert to the Roman Church, or you burn to death, probably after being tortured. The real Luciferians, of course, today are the Freemasons, who believe that Eve was first impregnated by Samael, producing the semi-divine son Cain. This was, of course, before Adam came along. And before Lucifer became Lucifer Morningstar, he was known as Samael, the Archangel of Light and Justice. This is before the fall. This is why the Masons describe themselves as the sons of Cain or sons of the widow. That's why they say, will no one help the widow's son when they're in trouble? As Samael, aka Lucifer, had left Eve before the birth of the child. Therefore, Eve was a widow. And as they were the sons of Cain, the Freemasons, they are sons of the widow. So to counter this age of confusion, there arose what is known as the age of chivalry. This was to incorporate degrees of initiation and later gave rise to the Knights Templar of St. John of Jerusalem, who went under many similar names but described themselves as the Poor Knights of Christ or simply the Knights Templar. So let's have a look at the aims of chivalry. It was an idea of conservation and propagandism, and it produced the association of the San Grail, the Holy Grail, whose members professed to be in search of the vase of truth, the Holy Grail, which once, of course, allegedly contained the blood of the Redeemer, or to leave metaphorical language and bring back the Christian church to apostolic times. They wanted to bring the true observance of the precepts of the gospel, but using the Holy Grail as an allegory. And indeed, if you talk to people who believe this stuff, they will say, well, the Grail could be a three-dimensional object, or it could be in another dimension. I've heard people talking about this, and there's endless waffle that goes along with this, which of course we are trying to get rid of and get to the point. So at the round table sat the knights who would attain rank and distinction after many severe trials. Their degrees at first were 3, which were afterwards raised to 7, and finally, at the epoch of their presumed fusion with the Albigenses, the Templars and the Ghibellines, the actual degrees rose to 33, which is of course what the Scottish Rite still use today, 33 degrees. The chief grades of the knights were, the first degree was page, the second degree was squire, the third degree was knight, and the 3 chief military orders of those days were the Templars, the Knights Hospitallers of St. John of Jerusalem, who afterwards were called the Knights of Rhodes, and lastly known as the Knights of Malta, and thirdly the Order of Teutonic Knights. And the Teutonic Knights fought alongside the Templars and actually officially outlived them. It was the Teutonic Knights who were allowed to continue after the Templars were disbanded. Of course, that's another story, and we're going to get into that because I've got a very good history of the Knights Templar, and I've got a good mixture of the esoteric side of it and the practical side of it, because remember, they were really not poor at all. They were in fact the Knights of the Money Temple. They were very, very rich. And of course, they became a threat to the Roman Church. So they were also persecuted. And I'm going to get into that story because I've had a very good history of the Templars, which I've put together from many sources, and I've had it for years. So we could call this show a precursor to the next one. Everything joins together at Windows on the World. It is a lifelong learning project after all. So initially, the Papal Church acted in the same way as the later Jesuits, of directing what they could not suppress, and having nothing more to fear than spiritualism, whether mystical, Platonic or chivalrous. Rome, instead of opposing the knights, actually turned them into a channel for the Roman Church, where instead of being destructive to the papacy, it became an infinite advantage to them. Central to the spiritual quest was, of course, the Holy Grail, both metaphorical and physical. The Templars made themselves synonymous with the story of King Arthur and the mythical Knights of the Round Table. Of course, you can read about that in such volumes as the Welsh Mabinogion, which was written about 13th, 14th century. So let's look at the tenets and doctrines of the knights. The chivalrous knights, those who composed the romance of the Knights of the Round Table and the Grail, were well acquainted with the Gallic triads, the mysteries of the theological doctrines of the bards, and also the Celtic myths. So we can see a romanticism coming back, and we now have the new Jerusalem, the new idea of Jerusalem. And of course, later we have, let's build Jerusalem in the green and pleasant land of Britain. I wonder what happened to that. Well, these romances have their origin in the phenomena of the natural world, and the Grail, the Holy Grail, is a diminutive version of Noah's Ark. Very symbolic. It has been supposed, and a lot of people still think this, that the love of chivalry was about the love of a woman. And this runs through such stories as The Lady in the Lake, where we have Lancelot being drawn to this lady who he sees in the lake. And it's all about a test, really. We can see how this influenced the later Rosicrucians with the texts such as The Alchemical Wedding. Very, very similar, going through 7 stages and being tested in this mythological way, very allegorical, all based on mythology. So, yes, the love of chivalry was ostensibly about the protection and the love of a woman in its highest, noblest and most spiritualized aspect. And this was the basis of a lot of the stories. The symbolic story, as we said, of the Lady in the Lake, for instance. But the lady love of the knight in the early period of chivalry was actually the Virgin Sophia, philosophy personified. So we're talking about the Sophia of the Gnostics, the earth. This goes into the worship through the ancient Greeks. And we see how all of this stuff fits together. So, in other words, it goes away from the central core of Christianity. The phraseology employed in the rites of initiation, the religious vows taken on these occasions, the ordeals to which the knights submitted, with many other circumstances, sufficiently indicated that the love so constantly spoken of has no reference to earthly love. It was a spiritual quest, allegedly, of course. The knight statutes also greatly resembled those of the Templars and Hospitallers. So the age of chivalry then goes into being incorporated into the mythology around the Templars and the Knights Hospitallers of St. John of Jerusalem, who allegedly actually inherited the Templar money when things went wrong for the Templars. So they were more a religious order, bound to very strict lives. Their clothes were of 3 colours only. They had 2 meals a day and drank only water, which was not really fit for a militia force whose duties were not always spiritual. For besides their special duties, they were also subject to all the rules of chivalry and bound to protect the weak against the strong, to restore peace where it had been disturbed, to serve their body, the lodge, and protect the evangelical religion. They are said to have branded their right arms in sign of their fraternity, but this is perhaps only a figure of the baptism of fire and the Spirit, one of the most essential rites of the so-called religion of love. So we can see that things got heavily romanticized here. And then, of course, the Holy Grail was attached to the story. And this is interesting. According to Templar mythology, the Grail in one place was a green glass vase said to be the original Grail. And it was preserved in the Cathedral of Genoa and considered so valuable that it required special permission from the municipality to even see it. It was by some authority, somebody said this, it was said to be cut out of a gigantic emerald. But the French, who during the first rule of Napoleon had carried it to Paris, had it chemically tested and proved it to be merely green glass. So alongside the Templars and the age of chivalry, the quest for supernatural relics became another branch of the Roman Church, with its holy relics and bones of saints and the associated relics of the crucifixion, all used to further the mystery of the universal church. None of this, of course, had anything to do with the initial simplicity of the original Christians, who had been persecuted, killed, or absorbed into the new Church of Rome. The reactions against the universal church, including, of course, the later Reformation, saw thousands persecuted. According to some records that I've seen, 10,000 accused heretics a year died during the Inquisition. So, when the simplicity of the true faith of the early Christians is usurped, as it was, through power and control, only chaos and disorder flourished. And this, of course, was brought under control through these methods of the Inquisition and of the Roman Church as we know it today. So, are we just dealing with another sacrificial cult? Are we just dealing with the updated Mithraism? We do see the ritual and dogma of the universal church. It is incredibly long, incredibly complicated, and impenetrable to those who are merely the congregation. And of course, with Vatican II in 1962, when the priest allegedly turned his back on God, what do we have now? The Roman Church is the new global cult aligned with the globalists. And we have to question what we mean by the church in the present times. The church is now termed to be community. They are not using the word church anymore. So even the Church of England has fallen. So it is a time for true faith. And the aim of the one of true faith is to live simply through the way, the simplicity of the early Christianity, through God's providence and without the dogma and ritual of the self-appointed priesthood. I hope you found that interesting and above all useful. I've dug into quite a lot of history there and put it together, and I think we've done quite well in 43 minutes. I got so fed up with reading about mythology and the endless information which didn't really help, so I put this together with a view to clarifying a few things and to bring together strands which we've been talking about in the shows. So, until the next show, thanks to everyone who stays in touch through the website. It's info@windowsontheworld.net. Do help us out if you can, and you can do that on the homepage at Windows on the World. You can join a Patreon. You can help us out on the front page of the website, or you can join the £5 a month club, and it helps to keep things going because there's a lot more I want to do. In fact, I think our shows over the past several years have been getting better and better, and my interest in honing down this information and making it clear has actually grown with that. I'm enjoying this tremendously. I'm finding it a lifelong learning project, and the comments when I re-upload some of the shows on places like YouTube are very good because it shows me that people are finding this information beneficial and useful. And of course, the idea is to go off and you can do further research. That's why it's good to outline this information, make it simple and direct. And everything that is useful has to be simple and direct. So until the next show, thanks a lot to everybody who supports us.